Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? We've been familiar with downloadable games for quite a while. They're easy and convenient. But like the rest of the entertainment industry, things are changing dramatically. So where does the concept of game streaming fit in? Now, of course, online game libraries are nothing new. Things like PS Plus and Xbox Live and Game Pass and even EA's Origin Access, we've been familiar with these things for quite a while now, and they have proven to be quite popular. For a certain amount of money every month or every year, you get access to a selection of games that you can download to your console and play whenever you want. And it ends up being a really good value for certain kinds of gamers. Now, the big common element across all of those game library types of services is that you still need a console to play them on. If you have a subscription to PlayStation Plus, you still need a PlayStation console. Same thing with Xbox Live, it only works on Xbox consoles. And because those games get downloaded and saved to your console's hard drive, those consoles need to have the horsepower to actually play those games. So it's really just kind of like a subscription service for what you would otherwise get just buying those games outright and downloading them. You're just getting a library from which you can pick, and you're perpetually paying for them. Now, there's been some major change going on in the gaming industry, and it's going to be really, really interesting. There are some commonalities, I think, with the concept of game streaming with a lot of the other media services that we're used to, streaming video and streaming music. And it's actually had a very similar kind of history. I mean, the whole concept of getting like movies and music online started with, well, the same thing that we've been seeing with getting games online, where you're paying for them once up front and then downloading them and keeping them. It's like a purchase. It's like you're going to the store and buying the game. You're just not getting the physical media for it. And those library services, just like with movies and music, have proven to be, pretty popular and a good value. If you subscribe to something like Xbox Live or Xbox Game Pass even, well, you can get a pretty decent deal, especially if you're a casual gamer. If you aren't that passionate about getting the latest and greatest like AAA titles on launch day, that sort of thing, it's just more of a, hey, when you get home from a long day at work, you want to flop down on the couch and, shoot some stuff up for a while. Well, for the 20, 30, whatever bucks a month those library services cost, it can be a really decent value considering that AAA titles go for $60 each. And if you're not a hardcore gamer, there's still some value to it. It's just another way amongst many that you have to play these sorts of games. It can save you some money if there are indie titles involved. Maybe it's a great way for you to check out new games to figure out if you actually like them or not. It's proven to be a very popular and beneficial type of service for the gaming community. Now, where things start to get really interesting is when we move from that whole download game model into streaming, just like we've seen with movies and music, where we started out and, you could buy an album off of, say, iTunes for $10 and you download the files and get to keep them, do whatever you want. But now we're moving into the concept of that subscription, and you can get access to everything, except you still don't get to download it all the time. In some cases, those services, especially on the music side of things, they let you cache files locally, but we've seen more often with the video side of things that it's generally just real-time streaming. And that's somewhere that the gaming industry has been kind of hesitant to embrace, but we're quickly heading in that direction. So it's not really a downloadable library that you're getting access to, but you're just playing the game straight up over the internet. The servers that you're playing the games on act as the console, And so your local device is really just there to show the video and accept controller inputs. Its requirements are dramatically less. We've already started to see some of this take place, specifically with Sony's PlayStation Now service that's been out for a little while. And some other companies are starting to get on board. For example, EA announced that it's working on a streaming service during E3 of 2018. And then at the time I'm filming this, some recent rumors and talk has been circling around Microsoft's version of that same thing. It's apparently codenamed xCloud. Nintendo is even kind of starting to dip its toes in the water. It's always been a little hesitant on subscription type of stuff. But with Switch Online and the access to virtual console titles that change every month, they're even starting to try to figure some of that out. Even though those titles download to your console, they're getting more and more into the subscription kind of mindset as well. There are definite pros and cons, of course, to moving to a streaming games kind of model. And this is something that I think has some people excited and other people nervous. Granted, of course, a lot of these are going to change over time as the requirements shift and some of the factors that are problems now become less of a problem as time goes on. So this is all subject to change, just like it used to be a problem with music and movies, and now, generally it's less of a concern. So some of the pros to going into streaming games. Obviously, the console hardware doesn't matter anymore, right? It's just a simple set-top box, if even. You don't really need to have any significant amount of horsepower. Just like with streaming video, you don't need to buy, say, a Blu-ray player that's got the technical capability of, reading those discs and playing them back. Now all you need is a relatively inexpensive device that can stream video. I mean, those can be had for what, $30-$40 at their cheapest? It's kind of ridiculous just how low of a cost those have come down to. So while we're now used to paying $300, $400, $500 for powerful home game consoles, and sometimes many more times that, if you're really into playing video games on a PC, building a dedicated gaming rig, well, moving into a streaming games kind of setup can dramatically drop that cost. For $100 or less, you can get a set-top box type of device that you can plug into your TV and just play these games. And the real benefit to doing that is you won't have to keep upgrading that device. Just like with dropping $300 to $500 on a console or more on a PC, as time goes on, you're going to want to upgrade. The game requirements become more stringent. The performance requirements become higher. And so every console generation, if you're really into playing the latest and greatest games, you are going to have to upgrade that console again at that cost, or you're going to have to periodically upgrade your gaming PC, put in new video cards or add more RAM, upgrade your CPU, whatever. With streaming games, it's going to be the same device that you play them on because all those upgrades happen on the back end. It suddenly becomes the streaming provider's problem to keep up with hardware requirements. So they're just going to have data centers full of servers, probably with GPU cards and stuff installed in them to handle all of that processing. And as new technology comes out, it's up to them to front that cost and perform those upgrades. And you get to reap the benefit of just getting that as part of the subscription. I mean, you don't have to really upgrade your device to take advantage of increases in CPU performance or graphics capabilities as new games come out that have those additional requirements. As soon as the streaming provider gets its equipment upgraded, suddenly you get to benefit from that. It can be a really, really good deal just from a hardware perspective. But even beyond not having to upgrade a console periodically, it also opens up the concept of these games being device agnostic. We're used to seeing games only available for certain platforms for certain devices. Maybe it's a PS4 exclusive or an Xbox One exclusive. You have to pick your platform or invest in multiple platforms. If there's streaming going on, suddenly, well, the platform may not necessarily matter. You can potentially even get beyond having to buy a specific brand and model of device to play these games on, and maybe even be able to play them just on commodity hardware. For example, PS Now not only works on PS4s, but also on just regular Windows PCs. It's just an app that you install and you can plug a controller into your computer, and as long as your computer meets some relatively minimal system requirements, you're streaming games to a regular PC that were originally designed for play only on a PS4 or a PS3 or PS2. I mean, you can even get retro gaming involved in this to some extent as well. So now it's really opened it up where you may not even really need to invest in much, if any, hardware. If you've already got a controller and a basic PC, you pay nothing other than just the basic, subscription cost for the service. And then to take that another step further, so not only does the hardware not matter, but to some extent, neither does the location or kind of device. If you've got an internet connection and a compatible device, you can play your games from anywhere. You don't even necessarily have to be at home. And there's potential as time goes on to have these games even be available on mobile devices. So think about the possibilities for handing off between devices. Maybe you start a game sitting on the couch at home, and then you go to a friend's house, or maybe you're, sitting on mass transit or something like that, or you're taking a break at work and all you've got on you is your smartphone or a tablet. Well, if you've got a decent internet connection, you can just pick up where you left off with the game then and there. If you travel for work, you don't need to worry about having to pack up a console for, downtime at night. You're sitting in the hotel room or whatever. All you need is your laptop or a phone or a tablet or whatever, and your library is there, your game saves are there, and you can just keep going. And if you feel like playing something else, well, hey, you've got this entire catalog to pick from. It's incredibly convenient. And just like with getting into those game library services like PS Plus and Game Pass, where they're exclusively download only, streaming can be incredibly cost effective, not again just from that hardware perspective, but for the same reason with the actual game titles. For a certain amount of money per month, $30-$40, something like that. Even though PS Now, I'd like to say, is $20 at this time. We're not sure what, the Xbox service or EA service or whatever is going to come in at for pricing. But even if it was $30 or $40 a month, you're still saving a significant amount of money if you're really interested in the latest and greatest games. AAA titles, again, $60 a copy. So, you figure if you buy a new game every month or two, well, $30-$40, considering the breadth of the catalog that you likely have access to, is going to be a pretty compelling deal. Especially considering most people tend to play through a game like maybe once or perhaps twice and then never really touch it again. You can't return or resell downloaded games. So for a lot of those people, if you're getting into the expensive, the AAA kind of titles, you're dropping $60. That's $60 you're never going to get back. Whereas with the streaming types of services, at least you can kind of take that money and move on to something else instead of paying the $60 for a one-time kind of experience, right? So it's very cost effective in that regard. And then you, of course, get access to just a ton more games. And those library types of services tend to have a pretty good catalog of titles. Sometimes there's some, brand new AAA stuff mixed in. I tend to believe that it's more towards kind of, I don't want to say older titles, but not like necessarily the freshest kind of stuff. I'm sure license agreements tend to dictate that, the publishers are going to want to sell copies of their brand new games first, try to make as much money as they can off of that, the $60 a title type of stuff. And then after some time, after those sales have started to decline, then they become available on those library types of services. Whereas I have a feeling that when game streaming really starts to take off, we're going to see those titles available immediately for the streaming services because they're going to command higher play rates. These are going to be titles that everyone's going to want to play. And so the publishers are going to be able to have a little bit extra leverage because the streaming providers are obviously going to want to get as many subscribers as they possibly can because it's very profitable for them to bring all of these customers on. And so it ends up being kind of a symbiotic relationship where having those AAA titles available for streaming is a way to bring customers in. So the streaming providers are going to want to offer those. But of course, the publishers will also have some leverage to say, hey, look at all the customers you've got that are playing our titles. Don't you think you should give us, a little bit bigger of a cut on those kinds of games? So I think we'll end up seeing in relatively short order, game streaming really start to take off and become a very popular, if not kind of the primary way that people get access to new games. Now, of course, there are downsides to this whole thing as well. The first, of course, being, well, it's just another subscription service, right? If you stop paying, you lose access. And in some ways, you've also got a somewhat captive audience. As the industry moves more and more towards this streaming and subscription kind of model, it becomes kind of a take it or leave it type of a deal, right? If you stop paying, you lose access. So you've got a bit of a captive audience. The audience is going to be compelled to stay with it because not only will they lose access to new games going forward, but anything that they're currently working on or any games that they really like and want to revisit periodically. So companies will have the flexibility to increase pricing to some extent, and customers, well, they'll complain, but they won't have much choice but to simply accept those price increases. So, there's definitely some concerns there, even though overall, I tend to think people will save money. It's going to cause a little bit of unease because some of that control is being given up on the part of the gamers and being given back to the publishers and these companies. It also will tend to decouple games from their platforms. What I mean by that is we're so used to thinking of games in terms of what platform they come on, right? Oh, that's an Xbox game, that's a PS4 game, that's a PC game, that's a Nintendo game. We're so used to thinking of games tied to the physical platform that we play them on. Where this is a con is that while competition in that regard is good because it'll allow publishers to start up their own streaming services and it'll start pitting, Xbox and PlayStation even more ferociously against each other to try and drive subscription rates and all this kind of stuff, we'll start to see more and more options for this game streaming beyond just the main game console manufacturers that we're so used to. But what we're also going to end up seeing is a proliferation of these providers and kind of segmentation. It's very similar to what we've been seeing with streaming video lately, where you could have certain titles available, say, on Netflix, but then a contract comes up because maybe the publisher of those titles decides they want to start up their own streaming service. Well, suddenly they're no longer available on Netflix and they're available on this other service instead. Well, okay, what if you still want to watch those? Well, now you got to subscribe to this other service, but maybe there's still stuff on Netflix that you want to watch or Hulu that you want to watch. Well, now you've increased the number of subscriptions that you have to have. So in some ways, these services will compete with each other, but in other ways, they won't because they're going to start getting divided up. I have no doubt that long-term, both Sony and Microsoft streaming services are going to stick around, and maybe they end up being a really good place for indie developers to continue to, focus on trying to get their games out there. But I also think that the really big publishing houses, we've already started to see this with EA and some of the other game publishers. I think they're going to look at it and go, hey, we could make more money if we start our own game streaming service because suddenly the hardware no longer matters, right? If the hardware no longer matters, if these publishers are no longer beholden to Sony or Microsoft in order to get the games in front of console players, suddenly now they're free to do their own thing and dictate their own terms. So we'll start to see more subscriptions start to happen. it'll erode that whole value proposition. Again, like what we've been seeing with streaming video and the concept of exclusive content. Now, related to all of that, of course, is the internet requirement, and this is perhaps one of the biggest technical concerns behind the whole thing. Since it's streaming and not local playback, a decent quality internet connection is an absolute requirement. Server availability and performance during peak usage could be a concern as well, where, maybe it's that time of day when everyone's sitting down and wanting to play some games, and maybe a brand new game that's very popular just came out. Are you going to have to wait like virtually in line to be able to get a slot on a server in order to play that game? Well, it's quite possible. And in fact, Sony's PS Now FAQ makes mention of this, saying that, there are occasions where you could end up having to wait like in line, wait in queue for a slot on a server in order to play a game. So obviously that capacity would have to scale, and it's a lot more intensive on the server side than it is for a service like Netflix, where, everyone's sitting down at about the same time every day to, fire up Netflix and watch a movie after work or on the weekends. But at the same time, it's not necessarily as real time of a thing as gaming. It's not nearly as involved. The server simply needs to feed you chunks of a file over the internet in time while your device buffers and plays them back. Whereas game streaming is a very intensive, always to the, millisecond type of experience where you can't necessarily oversubscribe servers for game streaming as much as you can with other types of media playback, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. So that's definitely a concern. And then, of course, there's also worries about that internet connection and the way your device will interact with the server. What about input lag? Maybe you've got an internet connection that has a sufficient amount of bandwidth to handle the video streaming coming back to you. But what if you've got latency on that connection? Is that going to cause input lag? Is that going to cause, a frustrating game experience? And there are even limitations right now with PS Now. If memory serves, they're limited to like a 720p kind of stream. You can't game at, 1080 or higher. Plus, there's only support for stereo audio instead of surround sound when you're doing the game streaming thing. So obviously, those are going to get better. And like I said earlier on in the podcast, some of this is definitely going to change over time. As people's internet connections get faster and hopefully better quality, these concerns will become less and less. That said, it's still going to lock out some people. Having just the internet access part of it be a requirement for this to even work, and some amount of quality to that connection be a requirement in order for it to be a good experience, that's going to lock some people out, because there are, sad to say, still a decent number of people who just don't have very good internet connections based on where they live. Either they've got only one provider and that provider sucks, or they live in a part of the country or a part of the world that just doesn't really have much in terms of options for them anyway. And right now, those people are able to participate in, the whole gaming ecosystem simply because, worst case scenario, they can, order up a physical copy of it online, or, go to a store and find it sitting on a shelf there or something like that. They can still experience that whole local playback part of it. But as the industry moves more and more towards streaming, it's going to start to cut them out. And we've also seen this again with the whole, media industry sorts of thing. There's music that's come out that hasn't seen a physical CD release, simply because, well, they figured too few people would buy it. And in quotes, everyone has internet access. Well, that's not necessarily true, but it's cutting some people out of the whole thing. So to that extent, do I think streaming will necessarily completely take over and we'll never see physical copies or local playback anymore? Not at first, at least, and maybe not ever. But just like we've seen a reduction in the number of like movies that make it out on physical media and music that makes it out on physical media, we're going to see the same thing with games. it's only going to be the biggest, most popular titles, I think, that will still continue to see physical releases, and everything else will just stay online only, maybe streaming only going into the future. Now, of course, that raises concerns about game availability and preservation, right? Just like with what's happened many times over the years with services like Netflix, content can get pulled at any time for various reasons. The most common one, of course, is that like a license agreement or contract expires, but maybe there's a scenario where a company could just decide to retire an older title. Maybe the library is getting too long and they want to make more server capacity for newer stuff coming out. Or maybe they don't want to keep renewing licensing on games that people just aren't playing that much. So maybe they go through that list periodically and find the least played titles and just start cutting them out. Well, even though they're least played doesn't necessarily mean that some people aren't playing them at all. Maybe there's a very small but very loyal group of people who happen to love a certain game that just for whatever reason didn't become incredibly popular. If it's available online only, and especially if it's available streaming only, suddenly those people are completely deprived of being able to play that game anymore. And it leads to bigger concerns about who is in control of the whole gaming experience. Right now, we're sitting at this kind of balance where it's halfway between the gamers, the people actually spending the money, and the companies. If you look at it from you go online and you pay $60 for a downloadable copy of a game, yeah, you're giving up some control because you don't have a physical copy that you can transfer to someone else. But at the same time, once you've downloaded that game and it's on your console's hard drive, it's going to continue to work for as long as your console hardware continues to function. So even if that publisher were to go out of business, or even if the console manufacturer were to go out of business, 20, 30, whatever years from now, if you want to play that game again, even if you don't have that physical copy, you can conceivably still play it, provided that your console hardware is still working. Once we've gone into a streaming-only reality for games, we may not have that option anymore. It's going to come down to all this legal crap about, okay, so this publisher shut down. What happens to those titles? Is somebody else going to go and buy up those licenses and reissue those games, or are they just going to disappear? Will they, get absorbed into some larger company that maybe doesn't care and it's just going to leave them locked away for a while? Or, maybe the company has these grand plans to periodically try to milk people for more money by saying, oh yeah, remember that one cult classic game that, got discontinued 5 years ago? Well, we're going to make it available on our, fancy new exclusive streaming platform for a limited time only or whatever, just to try to drive more profits. Whereas you look at it kind of the old school way, you go to a store, you buy a physical copy of the game, and it's yours. And you can do whatever you want with it. Give it away, sell it, play it on whatever console. Moving towards streaming is the exact opposite of the way that we've really been used to playing games. And I think that's the biggest concern, is perhaps that loss in control, that loss of the ability to preserve these games. Of course, the big AAA titles that end up being incredibly huge and popular, they're going to stick around. But what about everything else? Everything else, it's not just these, big hitter titles over and over again like we've seen. It's showing where gaming has come from and gone by seeing some of the really interesting stuff that smaller games and, publishers are able to do. The indie game scene, I've said this before, I think is perhaps the most innovative out of anything in the gaming industry, because they're the ones who are fighting the hardest for eyeballs. So they're not necessarily going with the safe bet, just continuing on with the, the lineage of a popular game franchise that they've always had. They're going to try stuff brand new and fresh and different. And the loss of some of that, if a contract expires or whatever from a gaming streaming service, that's really disconcerting. So I really hope that we can end up having streaming be just yet another option in addition to what we've got so far. Make it kind of like a 3-pillar type of approach for gaming, where you've got physical copies and you've got download copies where you store them, but don't necessarily need to have an always-on internet kind of requirement. and then this streaming model for those people who think that's the best deal for them. We seem to be kind of striking that balance right now with other forms of media, but like I said, it keeps tending to shift more and more towards streaming. So hopefully this is a lesson that we can learn from those other industries before it really starts to impact gaming, but I guess only time will tell. So with all that, I am of course curious as to your thoughts. Are you excited for the concept of game streaming? I mean, it is pretty exciting on its face. I know I ended the episode with a little bit of doom and gloom, and I didn't really necessarily mean to paint this whole topic with that type of a picture, but it is potentially a completely new way of playing games and very freeing because you don't have to worry about that hardware side. So are you excited about that? Or is that whole preservation aspect of it, the whole ownership concept, is that more important to you and maybe you'll pass on the streaming? I'm just curious as to your thoughts, so be sure to leave them down in the comments below. Also, if you're interested in audio-only versions of these podcasts, I have them available for Patreon supporters at all contribution levels. They're just plain MP3 downloads, plus there's private RSS feed support. Just throw them into the podcast player of your choice. And the episodes usually go live a few days before they show up on YouTube. It's a great way to support the channel. I hope you consider it. Anyway, if you like this one, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.